Hi, I'm Jenny Lauren Dowden for Conduit News, and today we have law professor at UALR, Robert Steinbuch, joining us. Of course, he's always here in his own capacity, but he's here to talk about the legislative session. There are a lot of FOIA bills to discuss, and he's here to break that down with us. Hey, Robert.
Hey, Jenny, how are you?
I'm so good. It's great to have you back on Conduit.
Always great to be here.
Listen, the session is going so fast right now. I would say probably the past 2 weeks or so, it's just like rapid fire with legislation that we're seeing in committees and on the floor. There are, I would say, at least probably five Freedom of Information Act pieces of legislation that is making its way through. I wanted to have you talk about these since uh, you are, as some dub, quite the expert on FOIA. Um, the first one right now that's making its way through committee would be Senate Bill 227 by Senator Clark Tucker. I know that you were in committee to testify for this bill. This bill tightens up the language regarding public meetings for elected officials. Talk to us about this one.
Sure. So this bill actually came out of the Attorney General's working group. And I had expressed some skepticism at the time about the working group because it had some sort of what you'd call pro-FOIA people and maybe some people who were less pro-FOIA, let's call it. And my concern was, hey, is this going to be a 5-4 vote kind of thing? But no, quite the contrary. This bill and one other bill are the product of the Attorney General's working group, and they are entirely consensus bills, meaning the entire working group endorsed these bills, both the pro-FOIA folks and the people who are, I'll just call it slightly more skeptical, right?
Right.
So to the credit of the whole group and the Attorney General, they did a really good job. So what's this bill about? The bill does essentially two things. One is the definition of an open meeting in the law today is very vague. And so the Supreme Court has had to interpret it on multiple occasions. And in doing so, they have made it less clear, if anything. Two cases, both brought by Joey McCutcheon, resulted in opinions that aren't very good for people who want clarity on transparency.
Okay.
And so what this bill does is it takes key elements from those opinions, fills in gaps where there were gaps, and says to everybody, both the public and members of governing bodies, here's what the law is. If you act inside the law, then you're fine. And if you don't, you will clearly be outside of the law. It provides that necessary guidance to everybody involved as to what is to be included in a public meeting and what need not be included in a public meeting. And it does it based on the substance of the conversation. There are two ways to limit the interaction of members of a governing body. One way is to say, hey, you can all get together, or a subgroup of you can get together. You all can go to the football game, to church, to dinner, whatever it may be. That's always been the law, by the way.
Yeah.
But you can't talk about certain things. And this bill defines what those certain things are. And generally, they are the substance of what's going to be discussed in a public meeting. So you can discuss background information, and you can, of course, discuss things wholly unrelated to the governing body, but you can't discuss what we call the merits or the substance of what's going to take place in a public meeting. Another way to restrict that interaction so that to ensure the public still gets to see meaningful deliberations is instead of dealing with what is talked about, then you deal with the number of people meeting. And that's another bill that we're going to talk about in a moment. So you could say, as this other bill does, two people on a governing body can get together and talk about anything, including the substance, including the merits, but no more than two. So that's another way to slice the pie. And that's my less preferred way for sure. I think that Clark's way is the better way to do it. So that's one thing that SB 227 does. And the other thing is it actually brings into executive session, those are things not open to the public, two topics of discussion that it makes sense to bring into executive session. One is discussions over cyber attacks because you don't want to
Mhm.
disclose to the cyber attacker what your
Yeah.
plans are. And then court-ordered mediation. So when parties get together to try to settle a matter pursuant to a court order, that they can do that in private. And I'm perfectly fine by that. And by the way, some people had criticized me to say that I'm really never in favor of an exception. And those are two exceptions I am in favor of. So just an example of balance on all sides, right? I've complimented various sides, and I'm now, as hard as it may be to believe, complimenting myself.
That's what to say, stomach. It's so hard anyone would
It's
criticize you.
sometimes my arm doesn't. How do you pat the?
Oh, you're okay. Listen, so I think you were alluding to this one, Senate Bill 376 by Senator Alan Clark.
Yes,
It's getting mixed reviews. Some people say, no, this is a good bill. It also helps clarify. Others say, absolutely not. This allows them to meet in public and then they can go and,
or
siphon
not
off
at
and
all.
work in various groups.
Right.
Give us your take on this.
Sure. So Alan Clark and Mary Bentley, two people I like and respect, by the way, and who I think are good conservative legislators, said, you know what? Let's try to attack this issue of public meetings from a different direction. Instead of trying to delineate what you can talk about and what you can't talk about with another member of a governing body outside of a public meeting, why don't we just say two people can talk about whatever they want? But if it's more than two people, well, that's really a meeting that should take place in public. This
All right.
same notion came up last session.
Yeah.
Mary Bentley, that is, had co-sponsored that, I think, with John Payton. I testified in the last session. I commented when Mary brought this bill this time before the FOIA Task Force, the same way that I testified when this bill was just up in the state agencies committee. I said the same thing. So I've been saying the same thing for years. And what I said was, I prefer that you don't allow two people to meet and have discussions. I think it's better that it's one person can obviously be himself, but when you mix it with another person, we restrict the conversations in the way that 227 does. And I said that 2 years ago. I said that in the FOIA Task Force. And with almost identical language, I said the same thing when Alan Clark, a very good conservative state senator as well, introduced his bill. And I sat next to him as I said that. And I said, but then I said, which is something I said 2 years ago when I testified against this as well, I said to the legislators, however, this is not a technical matter. 227 deals with a lot of technical law.
It
This is a
does.
judgment call. Do you think two people should be able to meet or together and talk about the merits or not? I would prefer not, but these are adult elected senators who are competent, smart people. And I said to them, ultimately, you have to make a judgment call where to draw that line. That's a true statement, and it's a respectful statement, and it's the way we should have conversations about things that we reasonably disagree on. And you can reasonably disagree on this. And that's what I said to them. And so thereafter, I said to the committee and to Senator Clark, if you do this, however, right now, there's a hole. That is, if you allow two people to meet, A and B meet, what happens if B speaks to C? And and D speaks to E, and I probably messed up the letters already, but you take my meeting. In a moment, you've basically created, through a daisy chain, an entire meeting. So I said to all of them, you can't pass this bill as is. I mean, of course you can, but you shouldn't. You should, if you prefer to have two meet at the same time, then you need to put in a restriction for the daisy chain. I also suggested, by the way, at the meeting, that they might consider tabling this bill till next legislative session. But I was aware of the count on this bill before we even sat down. Why? Because I do my homework. Why? Because I'm not crazy pulling out my hair, screaming like a ninny all the time that everything is the sky is falling. I knew that that Alan Clark's bill would pass. Alan knew that this bill would pass. So what happened then was Senator Clark turned to me and said, if I put in that additional language, will you in the future support that combination? And I said, to be clear, I still prefer that two people don't meet. But if what you're saying is, will you offer this as a compromise? And is that sufficient for me to say that's a fair compromise? Absolutely. Absolutely, yes. And so then thereafter, I'm told, because I don't follow these non-news commentary on Facebook, and I also don't follow people who, I'll just tell you, Jimmy Cavan apparently made some negative comments. Now, for those that don't know, you know, because you were there, Jimmy Cavan is a guy that punched somebody at a Saline County Republican committee meeting, and also has been now twice kicked out of the Faulkner County committee. So his sort of gravitas with Republicans perhaps has waned. And he apparently criticized me for saying what I said. Incidentally, when he came up in favor to speak in favor of 227, two things had happened before. It was clear that the bill was going to pass. Several conservatives who were skeptical, with whom I had spoken beforehand about this bill, as had others, had said both previously and in the meeting they would vote for the bill. The chair, Scott Flippo, who really runs a good meeting, he really knows how to do a good job as a chair.
It kind of keeps it entertaining too.
He does. He's a smart guy and a nice guy, and he says, basically, it's clear this is going to pass. So when we go to commentary, you know, it's okay if you just want to skip it. But Jimmy Cavan doesn't know how to skip a commentary, right? And so he gets up and he says he's with some Facebook site. And then he says, I appear in my individual capacity. Well, of course, those are words that I use because I work for a university and I have to make clear that my views are not of those of the university. I think that's good for me and good for the university. I think that's good policy. It's also required, by the way, but that's what that means. I don't know what it means to come before a body and say, I post on Facebook and I'm appearing in my individual capacity. But that's the problem when he testifies. He doesn't know what he's saying. It's just theatrics. It's all performative. I mean, does he need to identify that he's not representing his lawn mowing business? Because that's
okay. Let's get back to
okay. So anyway, my point about this is he testifies on that bill to no ad.
So 227.
Right, to 227. Okay. No benefit, and actually risked harming the bill. Luckily, it passed.
Yeah.
And so we get to Clark Tucker's to Alan Clark's bill, and he wasn't there to testify. Now there's some debate that he didn't, that was a misunderstanding as to whether Alan Clark was running the bill. I can tell you this, I knew Alan Clark was running the bill. That's why I testified. And I sat next to Senator Clark happily. And I testified against his bill happily. And he welcomed my commentary. And so my position is what my position has been for years. I prefer that we don't allow two people to meet substantively. I think it's a judgment call, and that judgment call was made, and I told the legislators, ultimately, you obviously have the capacity to make that judgment on your own. This is not something that requires some sort of technical expertise. If you consider my judgment, you shouldn't allow two people to meet. If you consider otherwise, then at minimum, you need to have these other protections built in, and those other protections are the ones that Alan Clark said he would build in. I knew the vote count before the meeting, and I saw the vote count at the meeting, which was the same. Everybody except Clark Tucker, who I like a lot, everybody except Clark Tucker was going to vote for that bill before the meeting, and everybody except Clark Tucker did in fact vote for that bill. So if you understand the legislative process, you think, well, this was a pretty good outcome. We got a pretty good compromise out of the whole thing. But if you don't understand the legislative outcome, and if your desire is to grandstand and to think that you have a role in substantive discussions about FOIA when everybody that views you testifying rolls their eyes, then you might disagree. And that's okay. That's freedom of speech, isn't it?
It is. Well, okay, I want to go back to 376, something that you said with one of the changes Clark made, and you talked about the daisy chain, and that's what I kind of referenced at the beginning. Is that what he put? Was that the amendment or the change he made?
He didn't make the amendment yet. He offered
Okay.
up the bill
Okay.
as
Yes,
is with the promise
as
that he
is.
introduce an amendment in the process. And someone
Okay.
said to me afterwards, how could you agree to that without seeing the language? I said, but I didn't. I said, I will agree to it if he provides language that is acceptable to me. I don't
Yeah.
vote in the Senate State Agencies Committee. I'm not a
Yeah.
state senator. So what do you mean I did
It would
agree
be
to it?
so much more entertaining though if you
Wouldn't it
were.
though? I said to Clark Tucker when he was kind of making a joking comment on SB 227. No, on an entirely different bill. I apologize. I said, Clark, I live in your district. I could run against you. And I like Clark Tucker.
Yeah,
Look, I disagree with him on a number of things because he's a
sure.
Democrat, but he's a moderate Democrat and he's
Yes.
a very smart guy.
Yeah, he really is. There have been a number of times in his line of questioning, especially in committee or on the Senate floor, and I'm like, man, I appreciate him because at times he is fighting for more conservative values than our own conservatives are, and
When
Conduit
it
all
comes
the
to
time we're like,
transparency in particular, right? He's a very
he
strong
is,
transparency advocate,
he
and I
really is.
admire him for that. And I've worked closely with him on that. And my appreciation of him before was high, but it's even greater now because I can see how thoughtful he is when it comes to analyzing the technical aspects of the
Yeah,
Freedom of Information Act. And that was my point when I said, when I testified on Alan Clark's bill. There was nothing technical about this. The committee didn't need my technical expertise. I was happy to share with them my judgment, and I did. But that's it. And they're
yeah,
entitled to make their own judgment. And
sure.
that doesn't mean I can't say I disagree with their judgment. But what more do you want?
Yeah. Okay, let's just say that 227 and 376 both pass, signed into law, enacted. Some would say those seem like they're on, complete opposite ends of the spectrum. So how do you reconcile those two very different bills now,
It,
or, if they were in
right.
law?
It's a great question. In fact, a question that I've had this conversation with others already, because as you know, I write the treatise on the Arkansas Freedom of Information Act, and I'm going to have to do precisely that in my book, reconcile these two bills.
Okay.
So it strikes me that what we're going to do is we're going to say that two people can meet as long as there's no daisy chain, two people who are on a governing body, talk about whatever they want. But if it's any more than two people, we look to the language on the merits, on the substance of the conversation to determine that that meeting of greater than two instead of greater than one, because there is no
Right.
meeting with one, that language then applies. I think that's how you will mesh those two bills if they both become law.
Okay. Well, we'll certainly be tracking those. You and I have talked about this often, especially after we saw the special session and the attack on the Sunshine Law. Conduit is now including a number of transparency bills in our scorecard. So of course we're following these.
Can I
Another
just
really,
comment on that? It's such an
yeah,
important point that because folks don't often, sometimes maybe, I don't know, often, whatever, don't understand what a scorecard is. Scorecard is when an organization that dedicates time and effort to pursuing a philosophy in the legislature, like Conduit, says we're going to look at key votes, not every vote,
yeah,
impossible. First of all, and most of the votes are irrelevant. Hey, did you vote to name that post office something? Yeah, we don't care,
yeah.
right? Post offices are federal, but you take my meaning. So you
We're talking
take,
about,
right? You take key votes and then you say, is this a conservative vote or is this a liberal vote? And then
yeah,
the more conservative votes, the person gets a higher score. And for years, we didn't have to score Freedom of Information Act at all. Why? Because it wasn't about left or right. It was about right or wrong. And we had people in the right on both sides of the aisle. And by the way, we still have people on the right, on the correct side, I should say, on both sides of the aisle. But now we also have some conservatives who are on the wrong side. And so now it has become apparent, no pun intended, that we have to have that as part of how we view the quality of a legislator. Yeah. And you guys are doing that now, and you're going to have some, hopefully, great scoring.
We hope. People have texted me or sent messages and about, why are you guys not including this in your watch list? Why is this not on your bill tracker? And what people don't realize is we have a very specific, narrow filter in which we look at every bill filed. And if it doesn't meet that criteria, and mainly focusing on economic freedom, growth of government, spending money that we don't have, if it doesn't fall into that criteria regarding economic freedom, it's really not our lane, our wheelhouse. And there was a lot of talk about, for instance, the Baby Olivia bill. I like the bill. I love Family Counsel. I love Jerry Cox. We work with him often. We're over here on economic issues.
That's right.
Family Counsel does a wonderful job with social. And, it was interesting to me watching all of the uproar on Baby Olivia, just a simple, video that's going to be shown in government schools. But meanwhile, you had Gonzalez's property rights bill, and I know that we're getting way off track, but I'll bring it back. But you had Gonzalez's private property rights bill in the House Bill 1510. It just passed the Senate, but it failed on the floor originally. And what that bill did was it protected your property rights, especially those in unincorporated areas, from municipalities and city government basically doing whatever with their land that they want without you knowing. It devalues your property, and they could have a 20-year plan with your land, and there's nothing you can do about it. And so that was a really big bill that ultimately failed, and no one was talking about it. And that's like one of the fundamental tenets of conservatism is our property rights. And so people will say, well, why don't you score this? Because ultimately, say, for instance, the Baby Olivia bill, that's not going to impact probably your economic freedom.
No.
But these other pieces of legislation do. And you don't have the social issues if you don't have economic freedom. If the government has all of your money and they can control what happens, these social issues don't matter. And I think that's just a difficult, I don't know if it's difficult. It's not, it doesn't seem to me, but people have a hard time understanding that, or really just hanging on to that line of thinking. To me, it seems at times.
Some folks want one-stop shopping. And as you mentioned, Jerry Cox does a wonderful job in scoring those types of things, the social issues. And you guys focus on the economic issues. But if we're making complaints about your scoring and your awards that come from the scoring, where's the award for the conservative professors that come on Conduit and help?
I knew we got off track.
Yeah, we're going off track. Is that not what? Don't you give out
I'll see what we can do. I'll see about an honorary award. I don't know. That Josh Silverstein, he's been making some rounds at the Capitol. I may have to have him on, and then we'll really
we can compete.
The best.
Yeah, we'll compete. I'm good with that.
Okay, I want to get back to these other FOIA bills, and I still want to ask you about the Access Arkansas Act briefly. Okay. House Bill 1621, that one is by Representative Wardlaw. Terrible bill. It's on our scorecard. We oppose it. It basically provides an exemption from FOIA for politicians, government workers, etc.
Are you surprised that a bill like that comes from Representative Wardlaw?
No, I'm not.
I guess that's a question to you, right? Have you scored him positively ever? No. Okay. No. Well, at least then that's a good check to see whether you guys are
you're
properly scoring. I mean, look, there are legislators who look out for the public interest. There are legislators who want to do good in the world. And then there are others. Can I leave it at that? Is that enough?
Okay, so I looked it up this morning before we got on. I don't see any movement on it. So maybe, maybe he's reading the writing on the wall and he realizes there's not an appetite for that, but I can't imagine why he would file it in the first place.
Maybe he should make a companion bill, which is that legislators, when they retire, get titles like Duke. It seems of comparable philosophy. I don't know.
Okay.
I just want to
No,
help.
no, I know you want to help.
Yeah.
Okay, House Bill 1492. You aren't familiar with this. I'll give you a brief overview. This is by Representative Gramlich. It's about having new devices in all of our schools. And one, it grows government and probably spends money that we don't have, but it gives like this emergency device to all employees in schools to use for a crisis or an emergency. I mean, that could be a number of things. But what's interesting is all of these thousands of devices that are going to be paid with your tax dollars are going to be going to these schools, though the records for any time that device is used will be exempt from the FOIA law. And I don't understand, if anything, that would be one thing that you would think would be included to see what happened.
Yeah, I'm not terribly familiar with this bill. And I do think that there's an interesting notion there, if we have to address the cost, obviously. But there's an interesting notion about having some sort of safety devices to be discussed. It reminds me, frankly, of requiring cops, to wear those cameras. There's a cost, but I think there's a benefit as well.
Sure.
I'm not saying that is or is not here. I don't know enough about it, but I think it's a worthy discussion.
Yeah.
But I
Yeah.
can't, for the life of me, at least at this moment, envision why, much like with the cameras, the whole point of the cameras is they are subject to FOIA. Why would you make the panic devices not subject to FOIA? Don't you think the public should know when there's an event warranting the execution of a panic device? Now, maybe someone trips it by accident, but then, of course, you still disclose it. It was tripped by accident. Whatever, who
Right.
cares?
Yeah. So we'll look into that one more. We'll follow that one. This one is actually in state agencies Thursday morning. This is another one by Senator Clark Tucker, SB 248. It's another FOIA bill. Some would say that this also extends an exemption, but I want to hear your take on it.
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of misunderstanding about this bill, actually. So I'm glad you raised it. This bill is the other bill to come from the Attorney General's working group, an entirely consensus bill, and a bill that I also endorsed.
Okay.
And yet it restricts slightly access to certain records. But it does so because one needs to understand the purpose of the Freedom of Information Act. It's for the public to have access to records of government operations. But as you well know, and Conduit does a good job of scrutinizing, government often reaches into our lives in an inappropriate way, no less. And when they reach into our lives, sometimes they pull out information, and that information shows up in a record.
Yeah.
Today, if you work for the state of Arkansas, as I do, being an employee of the university, that makes me an employee of the state. People can seek my personnel record, but they can't get anything that is in that personnel record that's highly personal. And there's a test written by the Supreme Court as to that information. They can't get it because that exception exists in the law today. Actually, there may be language in the statute as well. I can't remember if it's statutory, case law, it doesn't matter. Oddly enough, that same protection doesn't exist for you, Ginny, if the government has information on you that they put in some file. So it strikes me that you, Ginny, are entitled to at least the protection that I am because I volunteered to work for the state and I get that protection.
I don't know how I feel about this one.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I feel like if you work for the government, if you are a public servant and your salary is made up of tax dollars, your conduct, your, any review,
yeah, but all that, the bill doesn't change that. All of that, much of that is subject to FOIA. Some of it is not, if it's highly
Okay,
personal information.
sure.
That's the current law, meaning I'm better protected than you are. So
Right.
my information is not subject to FOIA, that narrow, highly private information, and yet yours is. And so are elected officials, because in this regard, they aren't considered employees. So the only people that get that benefit are people like me, employees. The
Okay.
employees have a higher privacy right than the public. And this
Okay.
bill seeks to extend that privacy right to the public. And while I'm a transparency advocate, I'm also someone who litigates and is knowledgeable about privacy law. Those are two things that, if done well, can exist side by side. And that's what the attempt here is to do.
Okay, thank you. That helps clarify that.
Of course.
One other FOIA bill that I want to talk about, it's actually a proposed constitutional amendment. It's by Senator Brian King. I mentioned this to you, like, which one? He has like 30.
Yes, several.
This one really just mimics what the FOIA group, what they proposed last time around, require any changes to access public records by the state legislature, be subject to a vote of 3/4 of both chambers. And it would apply to any potential changes in the Freedom of Information Act. What do you think about this one?
Yeah, look, I think that the FOIA and transparency is a very important notion. Obviously, it's one of my key areas of focus, commentary, public service. And the law that we have in Arkansas is very good. It's not perfect, but to be clear, no law is perfect. Humans write laws, and they're designed to control behavior, and they're inherently imprecise. But within the confines of that restriction, ours is pretty darn good. And so if we were to never change it again, we would still likely have one of the best Freedom of Information Acts for decades, if not longer. And so better to have a slow change to a really good law than to allow quick changes that might impact it negatively. So I think a supermajority makes sense in the context of the FOIA.
Yeah. I can't help but think that just because, Senator King gets a lot of opposition down at the Marble Palace, and especially right now for his stance on the Franklin County proposed prison. I hope that this has legs. I can't help but be pessimistic and think that it won't get very far just because of the bill sponsor. And I think that's really unfortunate that they play games like that at times.
It's call it politics for a reason, right?
I know. Steinbuch. Okay, one other thing I want to ask you about is the ACCESS Act. They had a really long hearing. Was that Monday? I believe it was Monday.
Yeah.
About this. They had a joint education committee meeting, and they ran both the House and the Senate proposals that both education committees voted in that one meeting, got both of the bills out. And so a lot of people, of course, there were a lot of testimony about the unexcused absences. I'm sure that you saw that.
Right.
But then also there were questions about professors and being tenured. And Senator Dan Sullivan had a good question. And he asked about, how do you determine what is unprofessional conduct?
Well, let's fill in, Ginny, what we're talking about more specifically for your audience. So the ACCESS Act, which I think overall is a good act, it seeks to sort of strip out the indoctrination in higher education that we see too much of. That's how I would summarize it very broadly. And it does so well. And it does so not only well, but in a way that is consistent with constitutional provisions of free speech, because that can be challenging. And I think it does that well. It also empowers administrators at universities to fire tenured faculty for certain circumstances. Now, some of them are perfectly fine. Tenured faculty commits certain crimes. I don't remember the details, but there's something in there about that. Sure. And a variety of other wrongdoings. And then it also says unprofessional conduct. So several folks, including me, have said to various legislators and folks in the administration, you do realize that unprofessional conduct, without any further definition, puts in the hands of administrators in universities the power to fire people for this amorphous concept. And
Yeah.
you need to recognize, this is still me talking to these folks, that administrators at universities are the most woke. If you're concerned about wokeism, which the Access Act is, the most woke at universities, and this really isn't in dispute, across the country, are the administrators. So you give them a power to fire people for unprofessional conduct. Who do you think they're going to go after? The liberals that you want to make sure are not indoctrinating our students, or the conservatives who say things like DEI is bad? There's a guy at Ohio University that they went after for that reason. They said, well, you said DEI, our DEI program is bad. We're getting rid of you. They didn't use the word unprofessional. You know what they were used? The synonym, uncollegial. So they went after him on a substantive, precisely the same substantive basis, because they didn't like what he was saying. So we said to the sponsors of this bill, Senator Dismaying and Representative Shepard, look, this is a bad idea the way it's worded. Here's one solution. Make them professional standards that are violated. Every academic discipline has professional standards. So Senator Dismaying said, well, the schools don't have to do this. Wait, what? So your defense for giving woke administrators an authority to get rid of conservative professors is we're hoping they won't use the bad device that we gave them? That's your defense? When Senator
Writing this, what's the point of even including it? Well, they might not use it.
They might not use it, right? Well, then don't put it there. If they might use it, don't give it to them. Hey, here's this really sharp blade that if you hand to somebody, he may cut someone, but he might not. He might not.
Leave it.
It's baffling. Then when Josh Silverstein spoke to Representative Shepard, Representative Shepard said, well, we don't like outside standards, which is what Josh and I and others had suggested, in the sense that we said professional standards, something written down.
Yeah.
And so Josh said, fair enough. How about you require the universities that are going to use this tool to establish, pursuant to the rulemaking process, a rule that a definition of what unprofessional is. And by the way, I think it was Senator Dismaying who said, well, they have to establish that ahead of time. No, they don't. No, it's not in the law. What do you mean they have to? They can just say that was unprofessional and you're out. And so Josh Silverstein proposed that alternative. Never heard back from them. Never heard back from the administration. Now, why would you not want to cabin such a grant of authority to woke administrators?
Yeah.
I had written a column on this, I think 2 or 3 weeks back. Why would you not pay attention to this simple notion if you're concerned about wokeism in academia, to protect from woke administrators going after conservative professors? And in fact, as you likely know, Josh Silverstein's not even conservative, but he's a moderate Democrat.
Yeah.
And you know what a moderate Democrat is in academia? Right of center. And so he said, Representative Shepard said, well, we're comfortable with this language. And Josh's response was, it ain't your job on the line.
Yeah.
About that.
I think it's interesting, like you said, just to grant this authoritative, subjective rule. And it's a little, I mean, it's not my job on the line. It would be yours and others, but it is a little scary when you think about it. It can be changed on a whim. One semester you could fire someone for, unprofessional conduct, and they did X, Y, and Z. The next semester, it could be something totally different. And we as conservatives, especially if you have Republicans writing the law, we're supposed to stand on principle and rules. And you can't just put something in there and well, we're going to use it however we want to. That's why we're going to leave it so vague. That is very dangerous to me. There
was another defense presented that said, that Amendment 33, which is the one that gives some autonomy to the universities, wouldn't allow a more narrowly tailored grant of authority in this bill. I have never heard more of a
Yeah.
gibberish statement regarding law. So the legislature is limited in the authority that it can grant to a university, and therefore it must grant more than less or none, because without that provision, you've granted no authority. So you've got to grant all the authority and put it in the hands of the woke administrators. So it's just
Yeah.
gibberish. And I really do get frustrated when I hear legislators and other government officials throw out gibberish, because it works sometimes for people who
It
don't
does.
understand the law. Oh, well, we're doing this for bananas. Oh, okay. Wait, what? That sounds like bananas. Did he just say
You know,
banana? Yeah.
it reminds me of, I have no life. Like even after work and they were done with session yesterday, I went back and watched House state agencies because they reconvened after session, and Representative Ryan Rose, I like
Yeah,
Representative Rose,
I do too.
but he has a bill that would, regarding ballot initiatives and titles, you would have to write them in such, they would have to be at an eighth grade reading level. And she's actually, I believe I'm not gonna, she spoke and she goes, like, why don't we apply this same to the legislature and bills that are filed? I thought,
Right.
what would be the reading level for some of these legislators? But it is worrisome. I know that
Yeah.
it would be total speculation, but why do you think they don't want to tighten up that language?
I don't have a clue. I think that they consulted with university officials amongst many, many others in crafting this bill, and that's perfectly appropriate, and
Sure.
that they were snookered. This often happens. You see government writing bills on behalf of agencies which are
Mhm.
not in the interest of that government entity and not in the interest of the public, but it is in the interest of that entity, that government entity, that is saying, "Oh yeah, we really need this," and
Yeah.
the executive branch says, "Well, I don't know, let's give it to them." No, let's look at it first. Here's a bit of irony. Josh Silverstein went, as we just discussed, to
Yeah.
attend and testify in that joint meeting of
I
both
watched. Yeah.
education committees. He missed, as a consequence, a faculty meeting, which is okay. That faculty meeting discussed the ongoing efforts at the law school. We're putting our night program online. And I have certain concerns. And Josh, I think it's fair to say, is even more skeptical than I am. And in that regard, Josh and I, that's a conservative viewpoint. Conservatives tend to be far more skeptical of sort of new
Yeah.
age, kind of tree hugging ideas, including those new age ideas when it comes to higher education, chief among them having an online program as opposed to an in-person program.
Sure.
And so Josh would have come and spoken in our faculty meeting, I suspect with some at least skepticism or criticism about the ongoing efforts to have an online program at the law school. Now, the new administration that we have at the law school has so far been very good at protecting people's free speech. So I have no criticism there. But
Yeah.
could you imagine Josh doing that in an environment that we've seen at the
Yeah.
university, this university, and other universities, like I just described at Northern Ohio University? If he were to describe his skepticism, maybe
Yeah.
he would wind up like that Northern Ohio University professor who described his skepticism of DEI, and they dragged him out of the classroom and
Yeah.
fired him.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
now to give the tools to some woke administrators to say, you're out because you were unprofessional. What does that
Yeah.
mean? Unprofessional.
It could just be someone like you mentioned, just disagreeing with
Right.
a policy or something that they are,
Right.
and you know what? You are unprofessional. You're not, you don't support this
Yeah,
program. Da, da, da.
you're not getting behind the program. Exactly.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's that. Yeah. I hope that Well, I mean, it's already passed the committee, so it's going to go to the floor and probably pass easily. But I am certainly glad that you and others have pointed that out. It's a shame that with an overall good bill, that's not something that could have been tweaked a bit.
It's really remarkable. And I'm amazed that there were no efforts, right? The question about whether students could take off time to protest resulted in an amendment.
Yeah.
But something regarding ensuring what few conservatives you have in higher education in Arkansas so far are not subject to woke attacks, you don't want to address? It's just sloppy.
All right. Anything else that I feel like we've covered a lot, but is there
Yeah.
anything else on your radar that you want to talk about?
I'm exhausted.
We'll have you back on very soon.
Look forward to it. Talk to you soon.